coming. I'd like to thank the panelists for being willing to spend some of their day with us to talk about this important issue. The focus of this is really on the impact on the individuals who are involved with succession planning for their farms. I'd like to acknowledge how important this is for farming families, whether they're transitioning to other family members or whether they're transitioning to people who are purchasing their operations. It's a heavy lift for everybody. Because of the deep commitment people have to their property. I also want to highlight that a majority of farms in the U.S. are family-owned and operated farms, so this is not a trivial matter. And in addition, USDA estimates about 70% of U.S. farmland is going to be moving into transition over the next 20 years. So it's obviously an ongoing and upcoming issue. So I'd like to welcome the panelists who've agreed to spend their time with us. Chad Reznicek is and I'm sorry, Chad, if I say your last name wrong. I apologize for that. Is a behavioral health state specialist working with Colorado AgrAbility at Colorado State University. Martha Sullins is agriculture business and management food system specialist, also working at Colorado State University. And Jeff Tranel is an agriculture and business economist, also working with Colorado State University. I'm Lorann Stallones, the director of the High Plains Intermountain Center for Agriculture, Safety, and Health, and we're hosting this. So I'd like to turn it over to Chad to begin he was given a question prompt. And I'm sure he'll have more to say about it. His primary question that we asked him to address was, how does succession planning impact farmer mental health and well-being? So, Chad.
Yes, will do. Thank you, Lorann. Appreciate the opportunity. Appreciate all the work that you do to support our rural and ag communities here in Colorado. So I am part of the Colorado AgrAbility project. I'm also the state specialist for behavioral health within Extension. And I have the privilege of being able to help provide behavioral health information, community skill trainings, and direct services for our ag producers. So that's just a little bit about my background. And part of the reason why we feel that this is important, there's a group of Western states, Colorado, North and South, all the way out to the Pacific Territories, called the Western Region Agricultural Stress Assistance Program. They did a survey a couple years ago of just under 800 Western region producers. The top concerns that they saw as their stressors were, number one, workload, number two, lack of time, number three was financial worries, and then number 10 in that list was specifically around succession planning. So we know from that data that it's very much front and center on everyone's mind. And then additionally, here in Colorado, we have the Colorado Agricultural Addiction and Mental Health Program. This provides free therapy for anyone involved in Colorado agriculture. To date, we've had over 1,000 hours of free therapy provided, and about 70% of clients coming on reporting what their presenting problems are have to do with either marital, family, or interpersonal conflict. And I think the reason why this is important, and I will definitely defer to some of the other experts on the panel as to the specifics of succession planning. But what we're seeing from the behavioral health lens is that it is often those relational pieces that can increase the anxiety around these topics. They can be hard conversations, and there sometimes needs to be some groundwork, both if I were approaching the conversation to make sure that I know what my values are, what my goals are, and that I can kind of keep my finger on the pulse of my emotions to be able to have effective conversations there. So ultimately, some of the feedback we've received, particularly from younger producers involved in the succession planning, is they wish that their parents would have had these conversations a lot sooner. And typically, in my experience as 20 years as a therapist, the things that get in the way of us making some of those hard choices and approaching some of those scarier tasks has to do with us not knowing how and not knowing why we should do it. And so anything we can do to help people figure those out can hopefully help them to ease into these conversations, do it sooner perhaps, and feel better equipped to do it with a clear state of mind and a clear set of goals that honor the contributions of all different members involved in these conversations.
So thank you, Chad, for that brief introduction. And certainly, if you have any questions, please be sure and put them in the question and answer section, because we'll have time at the end for further conversations about these things. So next up, we'd like to ask Martha Sullins to address the question of how do economic pressures intersect with family well-being and succession planning.
Sure. Well, thank you, Lorann. So, yeah, it's definitely a complex issue, and we certainly see a variety of responses in families. So, a lot of times, what we see when families are looking ahead to how they're going to plan for the next steps in their farm or ranch is that they're not really sure that that operation can sustain, the next generation. Can it sustain the parents, their children and spouses and children, for example? Can it sustain other types of business operations? And so, looking ahead to, what are markets for products? Are there opportunities to take an agricultural operation and really maybe pivot to something that provides an opportunity for that family to have just more business outcomes for the family members is one thing that we certainly work on. And then, obviously margins are really tight in agricultural operations, and so it's often a question of where can we make investments that are going to benefit that next generation. And then it circles back to what Chad was saying, is a lot of times there just aren't those really tough conversations about what the business can support. And so, having those dialogues early, developing financial plans that outline what the business is going to generate, what its cost structure is, what types of investments might need to be made to have that operation accommodate additional generations of the family or new types of markets for the products. Those are all elements that a lot of times just aren't addressed in family operations. So that's, just kind of circles back to why that communication, both verbal and written, is so important.
So that leads rather nicely into the question that we posed to Jeff, and that was, what role does family communication play in successful succession planning?
Well, it is the number one issue, as Martha and Chad have both said or alluded to. And as I work with farm families, they're not communicating. They'll talk about the weather, but they won't talk about the more delicate issues or the more difficult issues. And it's not everyone's fault, and it's everyone's fault. No one is without blame. Sometimes the next generation won't ask their parents some of those questions. Likewise, the parents won't ask their children's for their input and feedback on what they're planning. And as I work with individual farm families, I have conversations with both mom and dad, the retiring generation and the next generation. And after we get through the individual conversations, we have a group conversations, and without exception, I can visibly see a weight being lifted off of their shoulders because they have now had some of those conversations and they feel relief. They feel like they can now take the next steps, whether that is conversational or whether it's actually doing something that leads to succession planning directly, some of the mechanics and implementing the tools. But it's that conversations. And what I also find is they don't know how to have those. There may be some dysfunction within the families. Maybe there's some trepidation of, well, I can't ask this family member that question because he or she may get upset with me, may take it wrong. I'm not in a position to hear the honest answer that someone will give me. So it's a timing and a lack of ability to do that. They don't have practice. And one of the things that we've always taught, excuse me, families as we're working with them in groups or one-on-one is they need to practice these conversations. And Chad's in a much better position and has more experience as a therapist to talk about more about that. But I come back to, once they have the conversation, they are relieved and thank me or whoever the facilitator is of that communication.
Thank you, Jeff. Now we're going to open it up to communication across the panelists. And the question I'd like you all to address is share one specific approach or tool service providers can use to encourage healthy family communication around succession. And I open it to who would like to go first.
I can offer an approach that comes as Jeff was saying, you know, family conversations are so important. And so one tool that I use when I'm starting to work with a family that is just beginning to have those dialogues is a facilitated meeting where we really lay out what that process is and what everyone's role in that meeting is, and you know what we're driving toward. What we're driving toward is, you know, developing a succession plan for the family, but this is all of the family assembled there, their opportunity to engage in that dialogue, to be heard in a fair, unbiased process. And then my role as the facilitator of that conversation is really to allow it to happen in that fair and unbiased way, make sure all those voices are heard. And so I found that is a nice way to get to that point that Jeff was talking about, where people feel like they can start opening up in a business setting. You've got all the family members there, but what you're talking about is the family business, not family issues. And so that beginning those family dialogues, that's a tool that I use.
I would add to that, Martha, one approach that I use is when I'm working with a family, I always talk to mom and dad together and then separately ask one to leave the room. And then I talk to each adult child, or maybe it's a high school child that's leaning towards coming back to the farm or not, and his or her partner, spouse, whatever that may be. And what I find is quite often they need to vent. They need to get rid of some of the unproductive feelings they have or thoughts, and then we can get down to it. And in those group meetings, when we get together, continuing building on what you said, Martha, is never do it on Christmas Eve when the family is there. That's a good time, but never do it then. And never do it in any family member's house. It needs to be in a neutral site, because this is a business, not the family. You can talk about family things somewhere else, but you know, go to the bank, go to the extension office. There's lots of places for those meetings to be held in that neutral setting. And then there can be, if they're without a facilitator, they need to make assignments on who's going to play what role. In 15 years of working very closely with farm families in this arena, I've only had one family meeting in a family member's house. And I made them all sit at different places at the table. I changed things around. I made them uncomfortable so that they were out of their familiar roles and into a business partnership role. So I think that is really important.
Chad?
Sorry, I couldn't hit my mouse wasn't cooperating to get off mute. I totally agree with everything that Martha and Jeff just presented there. The only things that I would add to that are a couple reminders from the onset, particularly that conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. And that's, in my mind, signifies that people are passionate about the outcomes. They're passionate about their connection to the land, to the operation, to the future of this endeavor. And that's not a bad thing. And to make sure that that's understood as a positive, it's also important to set some basic ground rules. I love the suggestion about doing it outside the home so that we don't fall into those normal sort of familial roles. I also like to remind people, as we're talking about tough topics, that disagreement does not entail rejection. There's a difference in that. And the more we can be grounded on what our values are, what our goals are, and I really like to make it explicit at the beginning of tough conversations, to have every family member involved to be able to say, what are you excited about this conversation? What do you hope are the outcomes? And what are the parts of this that are threatening or anxiety provoking or stressful for you? So that we can get those things out there. And yes, it is very much a business operation. It is different than a family dynamic, and yet the family dynamic is embedded in that. So the more we can allow space to understand the human components and elements of this, and understand every person as an individual, the strengths they bring to it, and be reminded on our goals, hopefully it can help act as like a compass when things start to get a little bit dicey or a little bit difficult in these conversations.
So I'd like to switch the perspective up a little bit and ask how each of you would deal with supporting succession planning when it isn't a family decision, when that is not an option for the transition that's taking place. What's different about that particular scenario? And Chad, would you like to start first?
Sure. What strikes me, I guess, is different in that situation. In some ways, it feels perhaps less complex and less challenging because you don't have to navigate the family dynamics. I think the family dynamics add a whole different level of emotional attachment to outcomes and to the process. And so if it's an individual or maybe a couple that are looking at stepping away from the operation and figuring out what they do, then I would still go back to trying to work very much to clearly identify what are their values and their hopes in that, and just be able to, from my standpoint as a behavioral health provider, I just want to make sure they're clear on their goals and that those goals are in line with their values and that they can feel good about what that outcome is going to be. And if they have that and they are aligned, like the spouse and partner, then I would look to make sure that we could get them connected to people that can give the actual practical succession planning advice. And from that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Martha?
So, Lorann, in that case, were you referring, for example, to a family that's looking to engage in succession planning with non-family members, like bringing in someone else? Yeah. So I agree with Chad that it can in some ways be less complex, but I guess I would rephrase that to say there are different complexities, and I've seen a lot of those arrangements just not work out as well, or it take longer to get to that end point where you find that match that's shared values, shared goals and objectives, and the communication is different, I think, for those situations, because you don't have that shared background, but you have to develop a shared context. And I think that piece is just a different set of conversations. And I've been involved in those in a couple of different situations. And I would just say it takes maybe additional skills to navigate those. And I'll send some information. American Farmland Trust developed a program called the Farm Access Navigators. And so what they were trying to do is work with different service providers, and maybe we'll touch on this later, but trying to skill them up to have these conversations and act as like succession coordinators in a way, or transition planners, and help facilitate those discussions.
And
This would be a good time, Martha, to go into that in a little greater detail, and then we'll move to Jeff.
Sure. So this really arose out of the need to look at those, land access for new and beginning farmers, transitioning farmers. There are opportunities in, with private landholders. There are also opportunities with public entities. So there are counties and municipalities that also have land that can be used for agricultural uses. So I'm just giving you the background on how this program came about. But a primary target of it really is to work with new and beginning farmers and help them to find access to land, long-term access to land, whether that's very long-term leases or purchase agreements. And there are just a lot of service providers who didn't have the background in engaging in those conversations, bringing the very specialized service providers to the table to assist in those conversations. And so American Farmland Trust then built this program. So there's an entire curriculum as well as a training program around it. And so I saw Morgan put that in the chat, which is excellent. And so there are some YouTube videos, there are worksheets, and as I said, there's an entire curriculum that folks can access, which I think is, it's fundamental. It's kind of those foundational pieces, but is a really great place for people to start. So if they're working with their their county government, or they're working for a land trust, for example, it's some good basic information for them to have.
Thank you. Jeff?
So in my experience, families that are looking at transitioning their operation to a non-family member, as opposed to just selling it outright, has what Chad said. It's easier on one hand because mom and dad, or whoever, I'll just be historical, mom and dad do not have to choose amongst their children who gets to take over the farm, which is an extremely difficult conversation, and even to think about it for them. On the other hand, it's more difficult because it may be the children are not in line with that. Quite often it's already an employee of that farm or ranch. So they're going to turn it over to the hired man, so to speak. Well, now the children may or may not get the same inheritance as they might have. So they're giving up some. I always go back to, what is your goal? What do you want to have happen? Is it the legacy of your farmer ranch continues as a working operation, regardless of who that owner is, or is it something else? And if I can get them to agree on what those goals are, then the conversations can become difficult. Maybe it's not Susie who is the foreman of the ranch. It may be someone else that better matches the aspirations of the family, or brings new skills and new potential to the operation, whatever that is. But I always go back to, what's your goal for this operation? And if they can agree there, then those conversations can be easier. At least they're more directed. So like I said, on one hand, it's easier to have that conversation. On the other hand, it can be much more difficult.
Thanks.
That's a good economist answer. On
It-
one
it-
hand
it's
and the
always
other.
good. It's a balancing act, but
It is.
thank you for that. So I guess what comes up for me in listening to you, Jeff, is it then simpler if the family decides they just want to outright sell it to anyone, irrespective of whether it's going to be maintained as farmland or, be a development or whatever? Is that easier? Or do you think that creates new problems? And anyone can answer this question. I'm just curious.
It can be easier because then the inheritance, the estate is only dealing with money, which families will fight over money. Well, they will argue over money. Some of them will fight over it, but there's not the emotional ties that any of us that have been associated with production agriculture have. And that's anytime we start dealing with emotions, it becomes more, I don't want to say difficult, complex. Chad is one knows this better than I do as a non-therapist, but you bring in those emotions of that land and it gets difficult at times. I'll go back to it. You got to have those goals in place. What do you want to have happen? And if you can all agree on the goal, then the mechanics are secondary. But it's that true goal for the legacy of the operation, separate from the legacy of mom and dad owning and operating that farm or ranch.
Martha?
I was just going to add another element to that, Jeff. Just working along the Front Range, we see some different types of complexities. So, a lot of families look at, they've created this business and now they'd like to sell it. And two of the constraints that we often see are, one, if that land is protected by an easement, then there may be restrictions on what can happen on that property. So the building footprint may be limited. So if you're looking to sell that to someone who wants to put a different type of production on there, so for example, greenhouses or something that would change the nature of what happens on that protected land, it may run counter to the legal document behind that easement. So that's one thing that can cause a constraint. The other thing is, county and municipal zoning can really change the prospect for what can happen to agricultural land. So if you want to sell the property and the water, yet there may be real restraints on what can happen on that property. So it really limits it, and not just the types of activities, but then what types of income generating activities can you have on it? How much can you expand on that property? Because maybe you have zoning that restricts the number of passenger trips that can go out to that farm. So, this is more in that scenario where you're looking at some kind of direct marketing activity being an enhancement and a new opportunity. So there are just a couple of things that make it more difficult sometimes to do an outright sale, because the market value may be constrained by these other factors.
I would add, Martha, in some families, you may have a family member that says, there is no way this farm, whatever that farm looks like, is going to become a housing development or a greenhouse. We've run cows on here for a number of, generations. It's got to stay there. And the rest of the family is, well, let's just sell it or let's transition it to something. And so it's, that adds to the complexities.
I'm struggling because I have more questions, and I'm trying to figure out which ones continue this conversation in the most fruitful way. But I think let's talk about making referrals and think about making referrals. So, Chad, what are signs that indicate a need for behavioral health support, and how do you then sensitively refer families?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of the indicators that as you are, or someone is planning or anticipating this conversation, if you start to get a sense of dread, if there's this sort of turning in your stomach and you can feel your heart rate speed up, it might not be a bad idea to just reach out for some help and again get some real clarification on your own goals and values. I love that, you know, Jeff and Martha both talked about those goal pieces, and regardless of what we're trying to accomplish in interpersonal work, that goal clarification again acts as that compass that allows us to keep our alignment. And so if we're good on that, we can learn some basic emotional regulation skills just from a brain structure level. Our emotions can tend to, the higher our emotions get, the more that can counteract our best problem solving, our best planning, our best objectivity, creativity, and ability to accurately assess our situation. And so just learning some basic skills around being able to make sure we can recognize what our emotions are, but they're not driving the bus. And we can stay connected to those goals, that becomes really important. And within Colorado, again, with that Camp for Health program, Colorado Agricultural Addiction and Mental Health Program, it's easy to sign up. Right now, there's 6 sessions available for anyone involved in Colorado Ag. And if you just need a little bit of help getting your head around it, your goals, your values clarified, I would definitely encourage people to check it out. That's where it's there for, is to help our producers be able to have all the tools they need to be successful. Once you've got that, then working with the right people to help you with the actual logistics. And Jeff and Martha are, I think, some of the people I'd consider experts in trying to point someone in that direction. So I'll turn it over to them.
Struggling with unmuting myself, which is not normal. Jeff and Martha, I think that the question for you is, what types of professional support do families commonly need? You know, are we talking legal, financial, mediation? You know, what do you really encounter when you're dealing in this space?
Jeff,
Yes.
do you want to go first with the array of needs? I was going to say yes is the answer.
It is. Well, we are very fortunate in Colorado in that we have, it's a small number of very good attorneys that work in this arena. I've talked with colleagues from around the world, literally, and this is a huge issue. Agriculture is in dire straits when it comes to appropriately skilled accountants and attorneys. They just don't, there are not many of them. But accountants, I would say we have a greater problem than we do attorneys in Colorado. But I believe it comes down to, let's go back to one of your first questions, Lorann. It is the communications and that goal setting. They don't do that. Their farmers and ranchers are accustomed to yield outcome goals. They hope to get 300 bushel corn, or their calves will weigh 600 pounds at weaning, whatever that is. But when it comes to the softer, touchy-feely arena, that's not them. So they struggle there. When it comes to even facilitators, I suggest when I'm in a group setting, conducting a workshop or a seminar, I strongly suggest that they get an outside facilitator, not a mediator, a facilitator for these family conversations. If nothing else, I tell them, I can stick my hand in that oldest son's, close to him, not directly in his face, but I can put my hand up and say, Jeff, you need to stop talking and it's your sister's turn to start to say something. She's nodding her head, but she's not saying anything. It is time. Or even, if you have a domineering parent, whichever one it is, they have a long-term relationship of that. You've got to draw out that person, whatever comments that shyer, submissive spouse wants to say. And so there's not many of us. In fact, in the work that I do, there's not many of us across the US. You can get extension people, attorneys, accountants to do the mechanics, but the other stuff, not so much. In many, I get referred to clients by attorneys all the time because they're not skilled. They're not going to charge $700 an hour, whatever attorneys are charging for this, to go facilitate a meeting. Now, I won't mediate a meeting. I'm not qualified. I'm not certified to do that, but I can facilitate that. And others can as well, provided they have the right skills and aptitude to do that. And Martha knows my philosophy very deeply on that. But anyway.
Great.
So Martha?
Well, I would just add that the one area where I have seen a dearth of professional expertise is in tax accountants and CPAs who deal with smaller estates. So I've run into the issue where if it's a smaller scale operation, the tax professional might look at that and say it really, and this was very frustrating, this isn't worth our time. We're looking for a certain size estate before we will provide any kind of assistance. So I think, definitely have worked with some very skilled attorneys. And I saw a question in the chat, and I think or in the Q&A there, just to emphasize that for my role, I am most certainly not an attorney. I have no legal background, and that's never my role in this. It's, as Jeff was saying, it's to be a facilitator and to make referrals and to recognize what pieces still need to fall into place to build a succession plan. And sometimes I see this from another perspective. So I manage our our Building Farmers and Ranchers program. And so you wouldn't necessarily think that this is where you would see some of this, but we will have every year participants who come to us who are building a business plan to present to their parents to show what they would like to do with the operation. And so I think that business planning assistance is another really critical part of both communication as well as documentation, to be able to demonstrate with those goals and objectives, with a financial plan, with a legal business structure that demonstrates what the possibilities are for transitioning that operation to this, new and beginning farmer. So I think that's another place where I see a need for expertise is in that business plan development.
So I think it's time to open the floor to the questions from the people who have participated. We have one here. Do you create meeting notes from family business meetings so that there's a sense of being heard and not rehash issues in subsequent meetings? And there's another question from the same person. And do you create a written plan with progress map towards goals and timeline to complete? Very practical question here. Jeff, Martha?
I was going to say I can answer first. So I do create summary notes, but I always work from an agenda first, and an agreed upon agenda, so that we know what we're driving toward. We're all in agreement for each meeting, and there may be one meeting, there may be 4 or 5 meetings. It just kind of depends. But definitely working from that agenda to create that guiding plan. And then, yes, summary notes for sure.
I do take notes for my own purposes. When I'm meeting with individual family members and the couples, if you will, to start to formulate the plan. And basically it's a skeleton of a plan. The attorney's the one that's going to use the tools to actually build the plan. It's the analogy I use, and it's probably a bad one, but it's the family is going to build a new house, i.e. a future. What do you want that to look like? Is it going to be 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, open concept, 16-car garage? I don't care what it looks like. But when it comes to rehashing things, quite often they just need to vent for a little bit, and I can do that. And I guess I have broad shoulders, almost like a priest in hearing confessions. Just let them talk, get that out of the system. And once they've said it, they typically won't rehash it. Now, there are some people that want to, chew on that bone for a long time. And I've had to, when we get to the point of having a group family meeting, tell them, no, we already talked about that. We're moving on. And I can say that one-on-one with them or in the group meeting. I don't have a plan. When then in the group meeting, we're actually developing the skeleton of their plan. I share it with them. We go back and forth and edit it. And then I deliver that to the attorney, or I hand it to them and they can take it to their attorney, because it's the bullet points. Here's what we want to have happen. Our new house is going to look like this. Now build it for us.
Thank you both for that. The other question that we have is, what is your experience in revocable family trust?
I guess I don't know what what is meant by that.
So if the person who wrote that question, could you, there you are.
Hi. Yes, so a revocable trust is a trust that, so all of the property, things like that can be put into a revocable trust. And usually in my case, my parents were in charge of the trust until my father passed away in 2018. Then it was left in mom being in charge of it. And then when she passes away, then it'll be handed down to myself and my 2 sisters. I'm the executor of the trust. But I just wondered, because I haven't heard that term used much. And so I just didn't know if people didn't know what it was, or if it's something that's not used much in agriculture. My parents went through a lawyer, Brown and Brown, in Grand Junction to set this up. So everything's in a trust. The reason I brought this up was because we're kind of experiencing what Jeff had talked about earlier, of having a family member who is not on board in doing some of the other things that the rest of us are wanting to do. So actually what that did was it kind of caused my mom to pull back the revocable trust, so that she didn't need to have that daughter's input or signatures on things. So I just wondered what your experience was with that.
I have worked with families having revocable trusts of different types. You mentioned the revocable family trust. There's lots of different types of trust, and some attorneys rarely use trust. Some believe that that is the only tool in the toolbox. it depends on the trust. So I have some experience, not a lot, but I'm very careful not to provide legal counsel because, like Martha, I am not an attorney, and working for Extension, I am not allowed to provide legal counsel, and the state doesn't want me to as well. So I can help the family look at it. I can interpret those trusts somewhat. And then we get to a point, and if there's some dispute, it's like, okay, we need to get you with an attorney that really understands this type of trust as it relates to and is used for agricultural operations.
Thanks. Are there any other questions from the participants? I don't see any additional questions, so I think I'd like to do the wrap-up question for each panelist. And the first question, the question is, and each of you can think about this, is what is one concrete step that attendees can implement this year to better support farmer well-being and succession planning? One concrete step. Chad?
Sure. The one thing I'd suggest is to move all those nebulous thoughts and fears out of your head and onto paper. And even if it doesn't end up with a very concrete or formalized business plan or anything like that, just move it out of your head. That act alone of writing it down can do wonders. And if you are the type of person that you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night and you're running through those what if scenarios, that is a great way. Just keep a notebook by your bed so that you can write that down, get back to it when you're awake the next day, and get on with your sleep and taking care of yourself. The other piece I would recommend is maybe do a little bit of research on active listening and practice just in normal conversations, really being attentive to what people are saying and being able to even repeat that back to them so that you're not focused on responding, but getting very good at being able to listen to the information that's being put in front of you, catch that thoroughly, comprehend it, and then move on to the response. I think that's a really important skill in having tough conversations. So I'll offer up those pieces.
That's good advice for all of us at all times, the active listening part.
Easier said
Martha?
than done, but yep, thank you.
Martha?
Sure. I would say the one concrete step that families can take is, ask that question, what are your plans? If it's mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, ask what are those plans for the family operation, just get that conversation started. The fear of having the conversation, I think we all face this with if we've got aging parents, grandparents, just you don't want to acknowledge that there needs to be a plan in place, that there's going to be change. But I think just getting that conversation started with those, with the gentle questions, or it could be, as Chad said, just write those down, think about how you might present them. But I think just getting the conversation started out of a place of concern and caring is really where you want to be coming from. It's not anything else, but it's, your concern for your family members, for the business. And that's why you're asking those, a question to get started.
Jeff?
Geez, Martha, you took mine. Anyway, I want what Martha and Chad have both said are critical. And I would say that I call it a family council meeting, getting everyone together in that neutral site to have just even a practice thing. Don't have on your agenda, and it is a meeting, you don't need difficult topics. Start in slowly, but get the family accustomed to that. What I would add to the list of numerous things they could do is ask someone for help. You can't do it yourself. You shouldn't do it yourself. Call someone like me or Chad or Martha or others like us. Even if these farmers are going to the bank, ask your loan officer who can help them. Don't necessarily ask the loan officer, but ask the question, who can help us move from nothingness to starting the ball rolling towards a transition plan, a succession plan. And then that assistant, that service provider can get you rolling on those things. Maybe teach some active listening skills. Maybe it is facilitate the family meeting. Maybe it is just provide a kick in the behind to take that next step. So I would boil it down to take the first step in this process, and you will feel a person that does that will feel better. Their mental health will improve. They'll feel better about themselves. They'll feel better about the process. They may feel better about that child they haven't spoke to in 10 years or family member they haven't spoke to in 10 years by taking the first step to say, okay, we need to think about this. Let's have a conversation around that.
Thank you all. And as we move into wrapping up, I think we can all agree that succession planning does impact farmer well-being and the family well-being around the needs that need to, and the conversations, the difficult conversations that need to take place. I think also it's important to recognize that service providers don't need to have expertise in everything, but it's helpful to have the resources and be aware of what resources are available to support farm families in their area. So please know that we hope to be able to provide you with some of that information. As we wrap up, there's going to be a quick poll that will pop up because we'd like input and feedback on the work that we do in providing information. So please do respond to that as that comes up. We have recorded this session and we'll provide resources to everyone who signed up so that they can get the link and listen to this again, and also see the various resources that were provided in the chat. And with contact information for the panelists, and they can provide you with further resources as needed. We do have a training that's coming up on heat training. We have heat training coming up, and I think we have a slide for that, Morgan. I don't know where that is, but that'll be coming up in the spring. So the dates will be provided in January, and it's a heat illness prevention for trainers for agriculture business. Obviously seriously focused on some of the Colorado laws about how to make sure that we're addressing heat-related illnesses appropriately in agricultural production. And I think with that, I don't have anything else. Are any closing thoughts from Jeff, Martha, Chad? Thank you for being here.
Sure. I would just say really quickly that I think the biggest impact the biggest way that succession planning can impact someone's well-being, mental health, stress levels is by avoiding it. So I think all the action steps that were taken today, as it's been mentioned, once you take that first step and get your feet in the pool, it starts to create some momentum, makes it not quite as threatening, because it's usually the unknowns that keep us in this paralysis by analysis. So anything you can do to get that going, even if you make mistakes along the way, you're still moving in the right direction.
No, that's great, Chad. And I would just encourage anybody to reach out to any one of us, even if you want to have a preliminary discussion, and just you know, if that helps you get the discussion started with your own family members, I think that's wonderful as well. So I'm sure we're all happy to, you know, just chat with you if you have some questions or things that you'd like to discuss. So putting you out there too, Jeff. Jeff goes, no, don't make my phone ring more.
I really like Chad's comment, and I've heard it before, but I think it needs to be said again, is if you're waking up in the middle of the night or even during the day, you have all these thoughts going on in your mind and it's paralyzing you from moving forward, focusing on the task at hand. Write it down and come back to it later, or maybe just writing it down it moves it out of your head, but maybe that's all you need. You needed to express it some way and you can move on. And we all have that garbage in our mind. Well, I shouldn't say all, some of you don't, I do, that we just need to get rid of. And it's a good way, or as my dad used to say, go milk the cow and she'll listen to you very well.
Again, I want to thank the panelists and the participants for joining us for this important conversation.
Thank you for inviting us very much.
Thank you very much.